The letter arrived at 6:30 in the morning. Lord Ashcombe, Edward Harrington, 5th Duke of Ashcombe, was still in his dressing gown when his steward, Mr. Peel, burst through the study door without knocking. That alone told him something was terribly wrong. Peel had served the Ashcombe household for 19 years. The man had never once entered a room without knocking, not even during the fire of 1841. "Your Grace." Peel's voice was controlled, but only barely. He held the letter at arm's length, as though it carried plague. "It concerns Mr. Harcastle." Edward set down his tea. Frederick Harcastle was the finest royal interpreter in England. The man spoke 6 European languages without accent, had served 3 prime ministers, and possessed the rare gift of making foreign dignitaries feel they were being understood rather than merely heard. Edward had personally secured him for the summit, pulling in a favor from the Foreign Office that had taken 2 years to earn. He took the letter, read it once, then read it again. Mr. Harcastle collapsed yesterday evening at his London residence. The physician believes it to be a severe inflammation of the lungs. He will not recover within the fortnight, possibly longer. I write with the deepest regret and remain, yours faithfully, Dr. J. Moorfield. Edward placed the letter on his desk with the careful precision of a man who was deciding, in that exact moment, not to panic. He failed. "The summit begins in 4 days," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. 7 delegations: France, Prussia, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Austria, and Italy. 43 delegates in total, most of whom speak no English or claim not to when it suits them." "Yes, Your Grace." "And the only man in England qualified to interpret for all 7 nations is currently bedridden in Kensington with inflamed lungs." "That is correct, Your Grace." Edward stood, moved to the window, and stared out at the Yorkshire moors stretching grey and endless beneath the morning cloud. This summit had been 18 months in the making. 3 trade routes, 2 neutrality agreements, and 1 very delicate matter concerning Portuguese shipping rights in the North Sea, all of it balanced on the thin thread of civil, accurate, unbiased communication between men who did not trust each other and did not share a single common tongue. Without an interpreter, there was no summit. Without a summit, there was no treaty. And without the treaty, the Foreign Office had made it quietly clear to Edward that his political future would become considerably less comfortable. "Send to London immediately," he said. "Contact every interpreter on the Foreign Office's recommended list." "I anticipated that, Your Grace." Peel produced a second sheet of paper. "I took the liberty of sending riders at first light. Of the 7 names listed, 2 are traveling abroad, 1 is recovering from gout, 1 has already been engaged by the Austrian embassy for a conflicting assignment, and the remaining 2," he paused, "speak 4 languages between them. None of the same 4. Edward turned from the window. "You are telling me that England, the foremost imperial power in the civilized world, cannot produce a single qualified interpreter on 4 days' notice?" "I am afraid that is precisely what I am telling you, Your Grace." The silence that followed was the particular kind that fills a room when every option has been considered, and all of them are unsatisfactory. It was broken, unexpectedly, by Mrs. Dowd. The Ashcombe housekeeper was a small, broad-shouldered woman of 63 who had outlasted 2 duchesses, 1 attempted robbery, and a kitchen fire that destroyed the East larder in the winter of 1838. She appeared in the study doorway holding a fresh pot of tea, as though she had simply wandered in by accident, which Edward knew she had not. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, pouring without being asked.
"I couldn't help but overhear. The door was closed, Mrs. Dowd."
"It was not closed very tightly, Your Grace." He almost smiled. "Almost." "Speak, then." Mrs. Dowd set the teapot down and folded her hands. "There is a woman in the village. Whitmore is her name, Miss Clara Whitmore, unmarried, lives up at the cottage near the old churchyard, caring for her aunt." She said it plainly, without apology. "People in the village call her a spinster, and think her peculiar because she spends more time with books than with people. But I had occasion to speak with the French ambassador's footman last spring, charming young man, not a word of English, and Miss Whitmore translated the entire conversation for me without pausing once. Then she said something to him in what I later learned was Italian, and he laughed and shook her hand like she'd said the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Mrs. Dowd picked up the teapot again. I thought nothing of it at the time, but I thought of it this morning. Edward looked at Peel. Peel looked at Edward. A village spinster, Edward said slowly. Yes, Your Grace. Who may or may not speak 2 languages. 7, Your Grace, Mrs. Dowd said quietly. Or so the rector tells it. Her late father was a scholarly man, educated her himself, apparently. The village considers it an eccentricity. Edward was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the moors offered nothing but grey sky and silence. He had 43 foreign delegates arriving in 4 days. He had no interpreter. He had a political reputation balanced on the outcome of a summit that could not proceed without one. And he had a spinster in the village who made Italian footmen laugh. Send for her, he said. Peel blinked. Your Grace, the propriety alone. Send for her this morning, Peel. Edward picked up his tea. And pray to whatever you believe in that Mrs. Dowd's rector is not given to exaggeration. The cottage sat at the edge of the village like an afterthought. It was a small stone building, old enough that the mortar between the bricks had darkened to near black, with a low garden wall half covered in ivy and a wooden gate that needed lifting slightly before it would open properly. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, patient line. Someone inside was already awake. Peel arrived at 8:30 in the Ashcombe carriage, an unnecessary display of grandeur for a village lane barely wide enough to accommodate it, and knocked on the cottage door with the expression of a man performing a task he expected to regret. Clara Whitmore answered before the second knock. She was not what he had pictured. He had assembled, during the carriage ride over, a reasonably detailed image in his mind: shapeless dress, ink-stained fingers, perhaps spectacles sliding down an unfortunate nose. What he found instead was a composed woman of 34 with steady grey eyes and dark hair pinned neatly beneath a plain cotton cap. She was already dressed, which surprised him, in a grey wool morning gown that was simple but well kept. She held a book in her left hand with her thumb marking the page, as though she had been reading and expected to return to it shortly. She looked at the carriage, then at Peel, then, briefly, at the crest on the carriage door. Ashcombe, she said. It was not a question. His Grace requests the honour of your company at the estate, Miss Whitmore, at your earliest convenience. Peel added the last 4 words out of habit. They both understood they were decorative. Clara considered this for a moment. Then she turned back into the cottage and called over her shoulder, Aunt Margaret, I shall be out this morning. Mrs. Hatch will look in before noon. A voice from somewhere deeper in the cottage, thin but sharp, called back, Take your decent bonnet, not that brown thing. Clara reappeared 2 minutes later, wearing a dark green bonnet that was, by any honest assessment, perfectly respectable. She carried a leather satchel over one arm. Peel glanced at it. Dictionaries, she said simply, and walked past him toward the carriage. The estate announced itself long before the house came into view. First the iron gates, then a quarter-mile of gravel drive lined with oak trees old enough that their branches met overhead and filtered the morning light into something cathedral-like and still. Clara looked out the carriage window with an expression Peel could not quite read. Not awe, exactly, more like recognition, as though she had always known places like this existed and had simply been waiting for a legitimate reason to enter one. The house itself was enormous, pale Yorkshire stone, 3 stories, with tall sash windows that caught the light and a front entrance framed by columns that had been there since the previous century. Grooms appeared from nowhere to take the horses. A footman opened the carriage door before it had fully stopped. Clara descended without assistance, adjusted her bonnet, and followed Peel inside. She was aware, immediately, of being looked at. The footmen were professionally blank-faced about it, but two housemaids on the upper landing were considerably less so. A man she later learned was the Duke's secretary passed them in the entrance hall, took one look at Clara, and directed his next question pointedly at Peel, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong room. She was accustomed to that. The Duke was waiting in the library. Edward Harrington was taller than she expected, with the particular posture of a man who had never in his life needed to make himself appear confident, because he simply was. He stood beside the fireplace in a dark frock coat, holding nothing, watching her enter with an expression that was carefully neutral, the face of a man reserving judgment. His steward made the introduction. The Duke did not bow, which was entirely correct given the difference in their stations, but he gestured to the chair across from him, which was more courtesy than Clara had received in most drawing rooms. She sat. He remained standing. Old habit, she supposed. Men of his rank thought better on their feet. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I have 43 foreign delegates arriving in 4 days and no interpreter. I am told you speak several languages. I need to know how many, and how well." Clara set her satchel on the floor beside the chair. "Which would you prefer first?" He blinked, just slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The number, or the demonstration." She said it without any particular sharpness. It was a genuine question. A pause. Then something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Demonstrate," he said. What followed was 20 minutes that Peel would later describe, to anyone who asked and several who did not, as the strangest interview he had ever witnessed. The Duke named a language. Clara spoke it. He produced written passages, correspondence left by previous diplomatic guests, and she translated them without hesitation, occasionally noting where the original writer had made grammatical errors. French, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Dutch. Then, almost as an aside, she added Latin, which nobody had requested. When she finished, the library was very quiet. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "why does nobody know about you?" Clara picked up her satchel. "Nobody thought to ask, Your Grace." The ballroom at Ashcombe Estate had not been opened in 2 years. It took the entire household staff the better part of 2 days to make it presentable. Chandeliers lowered and relit. Floors polished until they reflected the candlelight like still water. Hothouse flowers arranged along the mantelpieces because the gardens in October offered nothing suitable. A string quartet was positioned in the upper gallery.
The formal dinner table seated 36, set with the Ashcombe silver that only appeared on occasions the Duke considered genuinely significant. Clara stood at the edge of it all on the evening of the 4th day and felt, for the first time in recent memory, completely out of place. She had worn her best dress. It was navy blue silk, 7 years old, altered twice, and perfectly clean. By the standards of the women currently filling the ballroom, cascading gowns in ivory and gold, waists cinched to architectural precision, jewelry that caught the light from 10 feet away, it announced her origins as clearly as a signpost. She had known it would. She had worn it anyway, because it was what she had. The delegates arrived in stages, each announced at the doorway by a footman whose French pronunciation made Clara close her eyes briefly. The Prussian attaché arrived first, a stiff-shouldered man named Richter, who shook hands with the mechanical precision of someone who had attended too many of these evenings and enjoyed none of them. The French contingent arrived next, 3 men in immaculate evening coats, led by Ambassador Villeneuve, who had the particular manner of someone who considered charm a professional tool rather than a personal quality. The Duke moved through the room with the ease of a man entirely at home in formal spaces, which he was. He had attended these gatherings since boyhood. Clara moved beside him, not quite beside him, slightly behind, as protocol demanded, translating introductions, smoothing transitions between languages, keeping her voice low enough that conversations felt private, even when they were not. Within the first hour, she caught 3 things nobody else noticed. The first was a misunderstanding between the Dutch delegation and the Austrian attaché over a remark about shipping tariffs.
a comment meant as a friendly jest that had landed, due to a subtle difference in regional phrasing, as a mild accusation. She repositioned the sentence before the Austrian's expression could harden into something that would require a formal apology. The second was a Portuguese delegate who had been addressing the Duke's secretary in Spanish for 20 minutes under the apparent assumption that the secretary understood him. He did not. Clara had been quietly filling the gap without drawing attention to the fact that an entire side conversation had been conducted in complete mutual incomprehension. The third was Ambassador Villeneuve. She had been watching him since his arrival. There was nothing obviously wrong. He was polished, attentive, every inch the seasoned diplomat. But during a lull in the formal introductions, he turned to the Duke with an expression of warm concern and said in French that he hoped the evening's arrangements were not too taxing, given the rather sudden nature of the gathering, and that he particularly admired the Duke's willingness to proceed under such, and here he used a word that translated, in its most flattering sense, as improvised. In its least flattering sense, it meant desperate. The Duke, who spoke perhaps 100 words of French and understood rather fewer, smiled pleasantly. Clara translated the remark into English, but she changed improvised to admirably arranged on short notice, which preserved the surface meaning while removing the barb entirely. Then she turned to Villeneuve and replied on the Duke's behalf in French, saying that the Duke had always believed the quality of one's guests mattered considerably more than the length of one's preparation, and that the presence of Ambassador Villeneuve himself was evidence enough that the evening was a success. Villeneuve blinked. He had not expected her to catch it. That much was obvious. He recovered smoothly, men like Villeneuve always did, and inclined his head with a small smile that carried genuine, if reluctant, acknowledgement.
The Duke leaned slightly toward Clara afterward, under the cover of the quartet beginning a new piece.
"What did you say to him just then?"
"I complimented his presence, Your Grace."
"He looked like a man who'd just been very politely outmaneuvered."
"Did he?" Clara kept her expression entirely pleasant. "Perhaps the candlelight."
The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that was not quite what she had heard from him before, less the clipped efficiency of their library meeting and something more considered, he said, "Where did you learn to do that?"
"My father believed that language without diplomacy was simply noise," she said. "He taught me the difference early."
She did not elaborate. He did not press her. The evening continued. More introductions, more careful navigation, more small corrections made invisibly so that nobody needed to feel embarrassed and the conversations could move forward. By the time the formal dinner concluded and the guests withdrew to the drawing rooms, the room had settled into the particular warmth of an evening that had gone well. Peel caught the Duke's eye across the room at one point and gave the smallest possible nod. The Duke gave no visible response, but later that night, when the last carriages had rolled down the gravel drive and the household was extinguishing lamps, he stood for a moment in the empty ballroom and looked at the chair where Clara had quietly, without any fuss at all, changed the course of the entire evening. He had badly underestimated her. He suspected he was not the only one who had. London heard about the reception before the week was out. That was the nature of the city. News traveled faster than carriages, and gossip faster still. By Thursday morning, 3 separate accounts of the Ashcombe reception had circulated through the gentlemen's clubs along Pall Mall, each version slightly different from the last, and all of them featuring the same detail that seemed to agitate people most. The interpreter was a woman. An unmarried woman from a Yorkshire village, no less, with no university credentials, no formal appointment, and no male relative of standing to lend her presence any respectability. The drawing rooms of Mayfair found it fascinating. The clubs found it offensive. Edmund Graves read about it in a private letter from an acquaintance at the Foreign Office, sitting in the leather armchair he occupied every morning at Whitfield's Club on St. James's Street. He read it twice, folded it with great precision, placed it in his breast pocket, and ordered another pot of coffee. Then he sat very still for a long time, which was, for Edmund Graves, the most dangerous thing he ever did. He was 51 years old, a King's College man, fluent in 5 languages, and had served as a royal interpreter for 11 years before a disagreement with a senior Foreign Office official over attribution, whose translation of a critical Prussian document would receive formal credit, had quietly ended his appointment. He had always maintained, to anyone who would listen, that the removal was political, that his work had been exceptional, that he had been treated with profound unfairness by men who feared his competence. There was enough truth in this to make the bitterness feel entirely justified. He had expected to be called upon for the Ashcombe summit. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most qualified man available. When the Foreign Office failed to contact him, he assumed it was an oversight. When he heard Hardcastle had been secured instead, he was irritated but philosophical. Hardcastle was at least a professional, but a village spinster? A woman nobody had ever heard of, with no credentials, no formal training, and no standing whatsoever. That was not an oversight. That was an insult. He began quietly that same afternoon, the way careful men begin things, with conversation rather than action.
A word here, a suggestion there, dropped into the right ears at the right moments. He mentioned to a member of Parliament he lunched with regularly that he had heard troubling things about the Ashcombe arrangements, that he understood the interpreter had no verifiable qualifications, that in matters of international diplomacy, the consequences of mistranslation could be severe, and that perhaps someone with the appropriate authority ought to be asking questions. The Member of Parliament found this very interesting. By Friday, Graves had spoken to 4 more people. By Saturday, a small but pointed letter appeared in a political circular, unsigned, questioning whether the Duke of Ashcombe had exercised proper judgment in appointing an unqualified woman to a position of such national sensitivity. The letter did not name Clara directly. It did not need to. Everyone who mattered already knew who it meant. Clara knew nothing of this when the anonymous letter arrived at Ashcombe Estate on Saturday morning. It was addressed to her directly, which was itself unusual. Correspondence for the estate staff typically passed through Peel. This had been delivered separately, slipped beneath the door of the small sitting room she had been given on the 2nd floor, the one with the window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She found it when she came down before breakfast. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone educated enough to control it carefully. There was no salutation. It read simply, "You would be wise to return to your cottage before you are removed from it publicly. Those who do not belong in certain rooms are eventually shown the door. Better to leave before the showing." There was no signature. Clara read it once, folded it, and placed it in the pocket of her morning gown. Then she went to breakfast, ate a piece of toast, and spent the next 2 hours reviewing the draft trade agreement the Duke's secretary had left for her consideration. She told nobody about the letter. She did not mention it to Peel, did not seek out the Duke, did not ask the footman whether they had seen who delivered it. This was not courage performing itself for an audience. It was something quieter than that. A woman who had received variations of this message her entire adult life and had long since decided that the appropriate response was to continue working. She had been told to leave rooms before. She had been steered away from conversations, excluded from tables, spoken over in company, and described in village parlance as a woman who had missed her only purpose by failing to secure a husband. None of it had stopped her reading. None of it had stopped her thinking. She saw no reason to let an anonymous letter in neat handwriting stop her either. What she did not yet know was that the man behind it had considerably more than letters at his disposal, and that the letter had not been a warning. It had been a test, to see whether she would run. She had not run. That, she would later understand, was precisely what made Edmund Graves decide to stop being subtle. The Duke did not plan to visit the village. It happened the way unplanned things often do, through a small accumulation of circumstances that only made sense in hindsight. He had ridden out early on the 8th morning, intending nothing more than to clear his head before another day of preparatory meetings. The diplomatic party had temporarily dispersed, some delegates resting at the estate, others taken by his secretary on a formal tour of the Yorkshire countryside, which they would endure politely
and enjoy not at all. Edward had 2 hours to himself, and he took them on horseback, which was the only form of solitude he had ever truly trusted. He had not intended to ride toward the village. The horse, which had its own opinions about direction, had other ideas. He found himself on the lane outside Clara's cottage before he had consciously decided to go there, which he chose to interpret as practical instinct rather than anything more considered. He dismounted, tied the horse to the gatepost, and stood for a moment looking at the small stone building with its thin curl of chimney smoke. Then he walked to the church instead. The rector, a spare, elderly man named Hollis, was raking leaves from the churchyard path with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere more pressing to be. He looked up when Edward approached, registered the quality of the riding coat and the bearing of the man wearing it, and set the rake aside without any particular fuss. "Your Grace," he said pleasantly, as though dukes appeared in his churchyard with some regularity. "You knew Clara Whitmore's father," Edward said. He had not planned to open with that either. The directness surprised even himself. Hollis considered him for a moment. Then he gestured toward a stone bench near the churchyard wall, brushed it clear of leaves, and sat down. Edward sat beside him, which was slightly unusual. Dukes did not generally sit on churchyard benches with village rectors, but Hollis took it in his stride. "Arthur Whitmore," Hollis said. "Yes, I knew him well enough." He paused, gathering the shape of something. He was not a man who spoke freely about his work, but the village knew, in the way villages always know things, that he had served the crown in some capacity. Diplomatic, we understood. He traveled a great deal when Clara was small. Then one day he stopped traveling and came home, and after that he never left again. Why did he stop? Hollis turned a leaf over with the toe of his boot. He never said directly. I always thought something had happened, some incident abroad that persuaded him the work was finished. He was not a bitter man about it. He seemed, if anything, relieved. He looked up. He poured everything into Clara after that. Everything he knew, everything he'd learned. Languages, history, the particular customs of different courts. How to read what a man means when his words are saying something else entirely. A small pause. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in any negotiation was a translator who only understood the words. Edward was quiet for a moment. A crow settled on the churchyard wall and regarded them both with professional suspicion. People in the village thought it peculiar, Hollis continued. A man educating his daughter the way he would a son. There was talk. There is always talk in small places, but Arthur ignored it, and Clara was too absorbed in the learning to notice or care. He smiled faintly. She was reading French correspondence at 12. Her father brought old Foreign Office dispatches home for her to practice on. She told me once that she thought they were novels until she was old enough to understand they were real. Edward thought about that. A girl of 12, reading diplomatic correspondence in French by candlelight in a stone cottage, believing it to be fiction. When did he die? 11 years ago. Sudden. His heart, the physician said. Hollis folded his hands. Clara was 23. Her aunt came to live with her the following winter. The aunt has poor health, needs considerable care, and the village, which had tolerated Arthur's eccentricities while he lived, found considerably less tolerance for them afterward. A scholarly woman with no husband and no prospects was simply an oddity to be remarked upon, nothing more. Edward stood slowly. He looked out across the churchyard, past the leaning headstones toward the lane where his horse was waiting. 11 years. 11 years of that education sitting untouched in a cottage at the edge of a village, going nowhere, serving no one, because the world had not thought to ask whether it might be useful. Did she ever try, he asked, to find work that used her abilities? Hollis picked up his rake. She wrote twice to the Foreign Office when she was younger, received no reply either time. He said it without bitterness, simply as fact. I believe she wrote to a translation house in London as well. They replied to say they did not employ women in a formal capacity, but they wished her well in her domestic pursuits. He said the last two words with very gentle, very precise contempt. Edward rode back to the estate at a pace considerably slower than he had left it. The moors on either side of the road were the same as always, grey and windswept and indifferent to human arrangements. He found himself thinking about a girl reading dispatches by candlelight and believing they were stories. Then he thought about what it meant that the stories had turned out to be real, and she had been ready for them all along. The Royal Hunting Lodge outside Windsor smelled of old wood, leather, and the particular staleness of a building opened infrequently for important occasions. It was a handsome enough structure, dark oak paneling, mounted stag heads along the corridor walls, deep fireplaces in every room that roared adequately against the October chill. The diplomatic party had travelled down from Yorkshire over 2 days, stopping overnight at a coaching inn outside Northampton, where the Prussian delegate had complained about the mattress and the Portuguese delegate had declared the mutton excellent, which Clara had translated for both parties with minor adjustments in emphasis. The lodge had been chosen for the private negotiation stage deliberately. Away from London's watching eyes, away from the social machinery of formal receptions, this was where the actual work would happen. The careful, unglamorous business of agreeing precise terms that would hold across different legal systems, different interpretations, and different national interests. Clara had been given a small writing desk in the corner of the main negotiation room. The delegates had largely stopped noticing her, which suited her perfectly. People said the most revealing things when they forgot someone was listening. The draft agreement had been circulating for 3 days in various forms. It covered 3 principal matters: overland trade access through Central European territories, port usage rights along the Atlantic coast, and a mutual neutrality clause that would hold for 20 years in the event of regional conflicts. Each section had been negotiated separately, with translators, Clara, moving the conversation back and forth, while the Duke's legal secretary, a careful man named Forsyth, noted every agreed amendment in his ledger. It was during the 3rd afternoon session that Clara first noticed the phrasing. It appeared in the Atlantic Port Clause, a section dealing with the rights of foreign vessels to dock at British ports during periods of trade dispute. The original draft had been clear. Access rights were temporary and required renewal every 5 years, subject to the agreement of the Crown. Standard language, entirely routine. But the revised version, which had appeared that morning after the previous evening's private discussions between the French and Portuguese delegations, contained a different construction. The sentence still read correctly at first pass. The meaning, on the surface, appeared identical. Clara read it 3 times. Then she set it down and looked at the fire for a moment. The construction used was an older form, the kind that appeared in continental legal documents from the previous century, in which the phrase "subject to renewal" carried a secondary meaning that had since fallen out of common usage in English diplomatic language, but remained active in French and Portuguese maritime law. Under that reading, the clause did not grant temporary access requiring renewal. It granted indefinite access that could only be revoked if Britain initiated a formal dispute process, a process so procedurally complicated that it had, historically, never once been successfully completed. The difference between the 2 readings was the difference between Britain controlling its own ports and Britain being legally obligated to admit foreign vessels for as long as those nations chose to request it. She did not say anything immediately. That was important. The room was full, the session was mid-conversation, and an accusation without evidence in a room full of foreign delegates would create a crisis before she had established whether this was error or intention. She requested, quietly and without explanation, a brief recess on behalf of the Duke, citing a document she needed to locate. The Duke glanced at her. She kept her expression entirely ordinary. "A brief recess," he announced. 15 minutes. The lodge library was small and dusty and had clearly not been consulted professionally in some years. Clara moved through it quickly, pulling volumes from the lower shelves, older treaty collections, maritime law compendia, a French legal dictionary from 1791. She found what she needed in a bound collection of Atlantic trade agreements from the 1760s. There it was, the same construction, in a treaty between France and a smaller coastal nation. A footnote, added by a later hand, noted the legal dispute that had followed 30 years after signing, when the smaller nation had attempted to revoke access and discovered the clause made it effectively impossible. They had lost the case. The foreign vessels had continued docking for another 40 years. Clara took the volume, marked the page, and returned to the negotiation room where the Duke was making polite conversation with the Prussian delegate about hunting. She placed the open book on the desk in front of Forsyth, put her finger on the relevant passage, and then wrote 4 words on the corner of his notepad. The port clause. Tonight. Forsyth read it, looked at the book, read it again. His expression did not change, which was a credit to his professional composure, because what he was reading was, Clara suspected, making him feel rather unwell. That evening, after the delegates had retired, Edward sat with Forsyth and Clara in the lodge study while the fire burned low. Forsyth explained the legal problem carefully, with the book open on the table between them. The Duke listened without interrupting. When Forsyth finished, Edward looked at Clara. How long would it have taken anyone else to notice this? After signing, Clara closed the book. Perhaps 30 years, perhaps never. The fire crackled. Outside, an owl called once across the dark grounds. Edward quietly rewrote the clause himself, with Clara beside him checking every word, while the foreign delegates slept peacefully 2 corridors away, entirely unaware that their careful construction had just been carefully dismantled. In the morning, the revised draft was presented as a routine amendment. Nobody objected. Nobody knew why it had changed. Someone in the room, though, had been watching Clara's face during the recess announcement, and that someone understood exactly what she had found. Bath received the diplomatic party on a Tuesday. The city had been chosen for the social stage of the summit, 3 days of assemblies, concerts, and formal dinners designed to soften the harder edges of negotiation with the gentler machinery of English hospitality. The assembly rooms on Bennett Street had been engaged for the principal evening gathering, a grand affair attended by local nobility, senior clergy, several members of Parliament who happened to be taking the waters, and enough well-dressed observers to ensure that whatever occurred would be thoroughly reported afterward. Clara had been to Bath once before, as a girl of 9, when her father had brought her along on a brief journey south. She remembered the stone buildings and the river, and the particular quality of the light on the crescents in the afternoon. She had no memory of the assembly rooms themselves, having been considered too young for the evening entertainments. But she had sat outside in the carriage with a French grammar book and considered it a perfectly satisfactory evening. She did not have a French grammar book this time. She had, instead, a growing awareness that something was about to happen. She had noticed Edmund Graves the moment he arrived. He was standing near the entrance of the assembly rooms when the Duke's party entered, not prominently, not announcing himself, simply present in the way that people are present when they have arranged to be somewhere and want it to appear accidental. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had once held a position of consequence and had not yet reconciled himself to its loss. He wore a well-cut evening coat and carried himself with the particular stiffness of injured pride held carefully upright. Their eyes did not meet. Clara looked away first, not from discomfort, but from calculation. She had learned from her father that the most useful thing you could do when you spotted a threat was to let it believe itself unspotted. The evening proceeded through its formal stages: introductions, a short concert from a chamber ensemble, the movement of guests between rooms in the slow, purposeful drift of these occasions. Clara worked steadily beside the Duke, managing the usual current of multilingual conversation, watching Graves from the edge of her attention. He made his move at 9:30. He had positioned himself near a cluster of parliamentary acquaintances and waited until the room had reached that particular pitch of noise and warmth where an announcement would carry,
but a response would be difficult. Then he raised his voice, not dramatically, but with the precise calibration of a man who had planned his words and his volume, and addressed the Duke directly across the room. "Your Grace," he said, with the smile of someone delivering a compliment, "I wonder if I might trouble you on a small professional matter." The room did not go entirely silent, but it shifted. That subtle collective adjustment of people pretending not to listen while listening very carefully. He produced a document, a page from one of the trade agreement drafts. Clara could see from the format, even across the room, that it was the Atlantic Port Clause section, though not the revised version, the earlier draft. "I have taken the liberty," Graves said pleasantly, "of having several passages from the summit documents reviewed by colleagues of mine, men with formal university qualifications in European legal language." He paused just long enough. "There appear to be some significant irregularities in the translations provided, errors that in a signed agreement could prove rather costly." A member of Parliament near him murmured something. Several heads turned toward Clara. She was already walking across the room. She did not hurry. Hurrying would have suggested alarm, and she felt none. Or rather, she felt it and set it aside, which amounted to the same thing in practice. She reached the Duke's side, glanced once at the document in Graves's hand, and turned to face the room. "Perhaps," she said, addressing Graves directly and clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "you might indicate the specific passages your colleagues found irregular. It would help to address them precisely." Graves had not expected her to invite scrutiny. He recovered quickly. "The third subclause of the port access section, the rendering of the French original." Clara recited it from memory. The French original, word for word, then her English translation, then a second possible rendering, and then, without pausing, the reason the second rendering was legally problematic under current maritime convention, citing the specific treaty collection she had consulted at the Windsor Lodge. The room was considerably quieter now. One of the French ambassadors, who had been standing near the fireplace, set down his glass and said, in French, that Miss Whitmore's translation was entirely correct, and that her grasp of the secondary legal implications was, in his professional experience, exceptional. Clara translated this for the room without inflection. An Austrian delegate added in German that she had in fact corrected his own secretary's mistranslation of a separate document 2 days prior, saving them from a formal error in the record. Clara translated this as well. Graves stood with the document still in his hand, and the evening continued around him with the cheerful indifference of a river flowing past an inconveniently placed rock. He did not leave immediately. That would have looked like retreat. But he had the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting a different kind of evening entirely and was now recalculating everything. Clara returned to the Duke's side. He said nothing. Neither did she. The chamber ensemble resumed playing, and the conversation in the room lifted again, like it had never stopped. But something had changed. Graves had failed publicly, and publicly failed men with wounded pride did not quietly accept the outcome. They planned. Dover in October was a cold, salt-bitten place. The harbour sat beneath chalk cliffs that caught the wind off the channel and sent it sideways through the streets in a way that made ordinary movement feel like an argument. Fishing vessels knocked against their moorings with the rhythmic patience of things that had been doing this for centuries and expected to continue indefinitely. Further along the quay, 3 larger ships, the diplomatic convoy that would carry the foreign delegates back to the continent, sat at anchor with their flags snapping in the grey morning air. The treaty signing was scheduled for noon. It was to be a formal affair, conducted in the harbour master's offices, which had been cleared and arranged for the occasion, with what the harbour master clearly considered appropriate ceremony, and what the Duke's secretary privately considered adequate at best. A long table, 7 chairs for the 7 delegations, ink and sealing wax, and the heavy leather folios containing the final agreed documents. A short reception afterward. Then the delegates would board their respective vessels, and the summit would be formally concluded. Clara had woken before 5. She had not slept well.
The inn they had taken rooms at was respectable, but the walls carried sound freely, and the harbour noise began long before dawn. But it was not the harbour that had kept her awake. It was something she could not precisely name, a background unease that had been building since Bath. Graves had been too quiet afterward. She had expected retaliation, expected another public manoeuvre, and none had come. Silence from a man like that was more unsettling than noise. She dressed early and went downstairs to the small parlour the Duke had reserved for morning use. Forsyth was already there, with the document folios, conducting his final review. Clara sat across from him and asked to see the port clause one more time. Forsyth slid it across the table without comment. He had learned over the past 2 weeks that when Clara wanted to look at something twice, it was worth letting her. She read it. The revised language was intact, the language she and the Duke had corrected at Windsor. She turned the page. Something stopped her. It was the seal. The wax impression at the bottom of the signature page was slightly different.
Not dramatically. A casual eye would not have caught it at all. But Clara had spent 14 days handling these documents, and she knew the particular press of the Duke's personal seal, the small imperfection on the left edge where the metal had worn slightly. This impression was clean. Too clean. Evenly pressed in a way the original never was. She turned to the endorsement page. The Duke's preliminary signature, applied 10 days ago at Windsor to confirm the agreed framework, was correct in its general appearance. The ink color was right, the formation of the letters was close, but the H in Harrington curved slightly differently at the base than the Duke's hand produced naturally. She had watched him sign 6 separate documents over the past 2 weeks. She knew exactly how he formed that letter. She stood up. "Forsyth," she said, "where did the document folio come from this morning?" He looked up. "It was delivered from the courier's bag at Sex. Standard procedure, the sealed pouch that travels with the party." "Who had access to the pouch last night?" A pause. "It was held at the inn's secure room. The key was with the duty footman." He stopped, something shifting in his expression. "There was an incident last night. The footman was taken ill around midnight. A replacement was sent from—" He stood up. "I don't know who sent the replacement." Clara was already moving. She found the Duke in the upstairs corridor pulling on his gloves, which was how she knew she had approximately 4 minutes before he descended to receive the delegates for the morning's formal procession to the harbour offices. She told him in under 90 seconds. The seal, the signature, the footman. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. "The real documents," he said. "Still in the pouch, I believe, beneath the false set. Whoever did this needed the forgeries on top for the signing. They would have removed the originals before we reached the table." He was already moving toward the stairs. "Get Forsyth. Get the harbour master. Nobody touches those folios until I say otherwise." What followed was not elegant. It involved the harbour master, 2 magistrates' officers who happened to be in Dover on separate business and were pressed into service, 3 increasingly alarmed footmen, and a locked room in the inn's cellar where the sealed pouch was examined with 4 witnesses present. The forged documents were there, as Clara had said. Beneath them, the originals, intact. In the lining of the pouch, sewn in badly with thread that did not match, a letter was found. It bore instructions in handwriting that Forsyth recognized immediately as belonging to a minor Foreign Office clerk named Albright. The instructions described precisely how the documents were to be substituted and when. They were signed with initials only. E. G. Graves was found at the harbour, attempting to arrange passage on a private vessel to Calais. He was not permitted to board. The treaty was signed at noon, as scheduled, using the correct documents, with all 7 delegations present. Outside, the Channel wind continued its argument with the town, indifferent as ever to the affairs of men. But Clara stood at the harbour office window afterward,
watching the diplomatic ships prepare to sail, and felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of someone who had caught the tide before it turned. The treaty was celebrated in London for a week. The newspapers called it the most quietly significant diplomatic achievement of the decade. 7 nations, 3 major trade agreements, 1 neutrality clause, all concluded without incident, all legally sound, all signed and sealed before the October winds had properly given way to November. The Foreign Office sent the Duke a formal letter of commendation.
2 members of Parliament who had quietly supported Graves's campaign suddenly discovered they had always admired the Duke's unconventional approach to the summit. Edward found this predictable and mildly amusing, which was how he found most things that came from Westminster. What occupied him more was a conversation he had been putting off for 10 days. Ashcombe Estate in late November had a particular quality that he had always found difficult to describe to people who had not seen it. The moors went a deep amber brown, the oaks along the drive shed their leaves in slow stages, and the whole property settled into a kind of considered stillness that the summer months never quite achieved. It was the season when the house felt most like itself. He had invited Clara back to the estate under the formal pretense of reviewing the final treaty documentation. There were loose ends, transcription queries, a Portuguese addendum that required a second opinion. This was true enough to be a reason, though not the primary one. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a sensible dark travelling coat and the same leather satchel she had carried on the first day, which he suspected contained the same dictionaries. It did. They spent the morning on the legitimate business, the Portuguese addendum, 2 transcription clarifications, a question about a Dutch legal phrase that had been rendered 3 different ways across 3 different versions of the document. Clara resolved all of it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, making notes in a small hand that was extremely neat and entirely without flourish. At noon, Peel brought lunch to the library. Clara began to stand, old instinct, the assumption that she would eat with the household staff or in the small sitting room upstairs. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," Edward said, without looking up from the document in his hand. She sat. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the November wind moved through the oaks along the drive and sent a scatter of last leaves across the gravel. Afterward, when the things had been cleared and the library had resumed its particular quiet, Edward set down the paper he had been holding and looked at her directly. "I intend to create a formal position," he said. "Official linguistic secretary to the Duke of Ashcombe. It would carry a proper annual salary, a written appointment, and full acknowledgement in any official correspondence. The work would involve ongoing translation and diplomatic consultation. There will be more summits, more negotiations. The Foreign Office has already indicated as much." He paused. "I want the position to be yours." Clara looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, a single oak leaf came loose from the nearest tree and turned slowly in the air before settling on the gravel below. "You do not need to do that," she said. "I am aware of that. A letter of commendation would serve the same practical purpose. A reference, perhaps. I could find other work with it." "You could," he agreed. "Probably, eventually. After sufficient letters to sufficient people who would take sufficient time to overcome their sufficient reservations about employing a woman with no formal institutional backing." He said it plainly, without performance. "Or you could have a position that requires none of that navigation, one that exists because you earned it and because the work is better with you doing it." Clara was quiet for a moment. It was the quality of quiet she produced when she was thinking rather than hesitating, which he had learned to distinguish. "People will say you created it out of obligation," she said, "after the summit, that it was the only respectable thing left to do." "People will say whatever makes them comfortable," Edward said. "They said you were a village spinster who had no business in a diplomatic negotiation." They were wrong about that as well. Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, more like a wall that had been load-bearing for a very long time and had just been informed, carefully, that it no longer needed to hold quite so much weight. "Yes," she said. "I'll take the position." The formal gathering at Ashcombe Estate took place in December, attended by several of the summit delegates who had remained in England, a number of the Duke's political associates, and a small selection of Yorkshire society who had spent October calling Clara peculiar and were now managing the adjustment with varying degrees of grace. The Duke made a short speech. He credited the treaty's success to careful preparation, strong legal counsel, and the exceptional work of his newly appointed official linguistics secretary, Miss Clara Whitmore, without whose contribution the summit would not have concluded as it did. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Several people in the room already knew, and the rest would learn in time. Afterward, when the guests had moved to the dining room and the library had emptied, Clara stood at the tall window and looked out at the estate gardens where the last of the November light was settling across the frozen ground. Edward came to stand beside her. Not the Duke and his translator, not employer and appointed secretary. Two people who had, over 6 weeks and considerable difficulty, arrived at the particular kind of mutual regard that does not need a name, because both people already understand what it is. "Your father would have found all of this very satisfying," Edward said quietly. Clara looked out at the garden for a moment longer. "He would have said it was about time," she said. And for the first time since the story began, she smiled, properly, not the controlled professional expression she had worn through receptions and negotiations and public attacks, a real one, unhurried and unguarded. The light held for another few minutes before the winter afternoon let it go. And that, quietly and without ceremony, was enough.